Hello. Let's just wait 1 more minute to give everybody time to join the meeting. Okay, let's start. So you have now joined the technical track, and the technical track consists of 3 different presentations. We will start with the green software engineering, what it is and what is SCIA. After that, there is the presentation about green design, and after that we have workshop about how to apply carbon measurements in your deployment. So I'm really happy to be here today to present this topic, and really eager to discuss with you all about what is green software and how to calculate the SCI. If you want to use the chat, we are able to monitor it during the presentation, so you can submit some questions there. And also, if you want to discuss about the green software, we are happy to discuss. We will also have 15-minute Q&A at the end of the session. You can also utilize that to get some coffee or other things to prepare for the next presentation. So let's start. So I'm Erkki Okala from Avanade, from Finland. I'm working as a European green software lead at Avanade, supporting our businesses in different countries and enabling the green software utilization within our projects. I'm also a member in the Green Software Foundation, assisting them to create the tools and practices how to make green software. I do a lot of trainings related to this topic, and I work as a technical architect supporting our customers regarding this topic.
Okay, I'm very happy to be presenting today for the GSF. My name is Benjamin Ninassi, and I work in the sustainability and technology team at Accenture France, but I think that you had guessed that because of my accent, in fact. I also contribute to the French Institute for Sustainable IT and to the French Eco-Responsible Digital Mission of the Prime Minister Cabinet, where we produce some common guidelines and referential on the matter of sustainable IT. I was previously in the academic world, more specifically a research engineer at INRIA for 15 years, INRIA being the French National Institute of Computer Sciences. I'm also a former member of the academic collective named EcoInfo, which regroup academic researchers and engineers studying the environmental impacts of digital technologies. I will begin this lecture by going into a little more detail on why green software is needed, and I will present concrete courses of action. I will take control now. Okay, great. So why green software? Watching a movie in streaming, booking a train ticket at any time, checking the road traffic on your phone. So many actions made possible since the 80s thanks to the internet. These actions involve a lot of material equipment. I mean, really a lot. For example, take the end user devices that you use today. In the 80s, we mainly used a computer to connect to the internet. Today, we can also use a laptop, a video game console, a smartphone, a television, a smartwatch, maybe a printer. So the means of connection to the internet also have multiplied via copper or fiber optics, satellite, and the radio network are piling up from 2G to 5G, multiplying the infrastructures needed. To all these equipments, we must add a growing set of connected objects. This is the IoT, the Internet of Things. So connected vehicles, smart city sensors, environmental sensors, connected health devices. So many revolutions that significantly increase machine-to-machine communication. Even our cars or our printers have now more computing power than our old PC. So, and of course, the needs for data centers have highly increased too. But how many devices make up the internet? How many men and women work on a daily basis to allow it to exist? What is its real environmental impact? None of these questions, which may seem simple, has a precise answer. Several factors make it very complicated to count all the equipment and overall the measurement of the activity allowing the internet. But there are, however, several studies that attempt to provide some of the answers to these questions. If the numbers are necessary estimates based on a certain number of assumptions, their order of magnitude nevertheless remains a useful indicator for understanding the materiality of the internet. So according to Cisco, that we can see here, in 2018, there were 3.9 billion people connected to the internet. That's roughly 51% of the world's population, 19.4 billion devices connecting to the internet, 33% of them being IoT. And with an annual growth in the number of devices of 10%, Cisco's projections predicted almost 30 billion connected objects by 2023. That's huge. In addition, these numbers do not consider the data centers or network equipment, but only the end user devices and IoT objects. Okay, so internet is a lot of devices, but how do they impact the environment? Of course, as they are electrical, the first thing that comes to mind is that they use electricity, and therefore they pollute indirectly via the power plants that produce it. These pollutions will depend on the geographical area they are used. A coal-fired power station does not pollute in the same way as a nuclear one, for example. It is also worth mentioning the impacts linked to the use of a device connected to a telecommunication network will require network equipment and data centers to communicate. So these infrastructures also consume electricity, but also water for cooling, and their production has other environmental consequences. But the environmental impacts associated with computer equipment are not limited to the effects of their use phase, electricity consumption, and far from it. Evaluating these impacts requires considering the entire life cycle of the device, its production, its distribution, its use phase, and its end of life. There are multiple types of impact, not only greenhouse gas emission. For example, depletion of exploitable mineral resources, water consumptions, various pollutions like soil and ocean acidifications, without forgetting, of course, the environmental impacts linked to the production of the energy used throughout the life cycle and not only during the use phase of a product. This graph here represents the evolution of the energy consumption related to the digital sector, according to estimates made by Schneider Electric. We can see there an anticipation of a very significant increase of nearly 30% by 2030. And we can also see that the device manufacturing is improving in the electric consumption part. One specific example, this is on the left graphic represents the contribution to the global warming potential of the different phases of the life cycle of a Dell laptop used in Europe. We can see here that the production phase predominates with 75%. It is also funny to see that the end of life appears in negative here because of the energy recovered during this phase, for example, by incineration of plastic elements. But I'm pretty sure this is not a good thing from a climate change point of view. I will not detail the impacts of the use phase here, which is mainly energy consumption, but when you deal with figures for the use phase, know that it is directly linked to the energy aspect. So it is important to specify the country and area of use because the energy mix is not the same everywhere. On the right, you can see a graphic representing the contribution to the various components of the same Dell laptop to the global warming potential. And we can see here that the printed wiring boards and the SSD hard drive are responsible for the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, a terminal end user devices is mainly made up of metals, plastics, and ceramics. And there is more than 50 different metals present in a computer or in a smartphone. And mining causes serious pollution of surface and groundwater, as well as air and soil. These pollutions are mainly due, on the one hand, to mining residues resulting from the concentration of the ore, which often contain toxic substances, for example, mercury or arsenic. that are liable to flow out in the form of mine acid, and on the other hand, to the chemical used during the ore concentration phase. For example, the leaching with cyanide for gold or with sulfuric acid for copper. And furthermore, the energy consumption and therefore its associated impacts is enormous at all stages of the mining process. So this is a spoiler alert for those who don't know. The green mine does not exist. In fact, according to geologist expert of the environmental impacts of the mine, this industry is the most harmful to the ecosystems, land, air, water, and biodiversity, including human population. Another problem on this representation, you can see here the natural elements. We can observe the one with a small drawing representing a smartphone on it. These are elements needed to make smartphones. The color indicates the remaining capacities to be exploited in the soils of the world, estimated by the European Chemical Society. So you may find that several of them are classified as being in serious danger of short-term depletion or come from conflict areas. This is another problem for the sustainability of software, our ability to produce equipment tomorrow. And this is the same thing for electric car and all the devices needed for the sustainability transformation. So after saying that, the way we are using and developing information technologies is not currently really sustainable, and their materiality is quite harmful to the environment. But the good news is that there is an opportunity here. We can do something. We can change the way we are doing things, and for the software industry, it means software eco-design. So I hope by now the #1 priority that must drive all our eco-design effort is clear for you. The first one is to avoid making devices obsolete. Number 2 is to avoid the use of unnecessary devices. And the number 3, the one that seems obvious, is to reduce energy and other resources consumptions. You must make every effort to enforce these rules throughout the entire software life cycle. It is really important to do this at all the stages. Because, in fact, an online digital service is constantly evolving. So the environmental impacts of its manufacture are constantly increasing throughout its lifespan. Each of the steps of its life cycle that you can see here will be repeated for each new version of the software. So for all these reasons, it is really important to take care to minimize not only the environmental impacts of the use of a digital service, but also those of all its manufacturing phases and its end of life, considering its entire life cycle. This is called eco-design. This is what green software engineering is all about. A major principle of eco-design, whatever the field, not only for software, is to apply the IRC principle. In particularity, the first 2 points. A is for avoid. Avoid, when possible, creating a new source of negative impact. It's always the best choice. And the R for reduce, when necessary, seek to reduce impacts as much as possible by being sober or frugal. So at each stage of the life cycle of a digital services, eco-design is possible. I will list on the following a few examples of good practices. These practices enables what we call green IT. But before that, just let us talk about another aspect of eco-design. When you design a software, ask yourself about the positive impact that your software can have to go toward a reduction of other negative impacts of your business. For example, the highlighting of environmental indicators of products sold on an e-commerce platform will encourage virtuous consumption practices. This is what we call IT for green, and that will contribute positively to needed business transformations. So back to green IT. So during the specification and design phases, I will not focus here on the functional and design stages, as there is a dedicated tech track on these two matters just after this one. But keep in mind that avoiding, as I said, unnecessary digital services or functionalities is always the best choice. The service that pollutes the list is probably the one that does not exist, in fact. So if at the specification stage, you cannot figure out if your software will take part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, for example, by allowing to reduce or to avoid impact of other industrial activities, do not do it. Just a word here about low-tech. Low-tech is neither cheap tech or old tech. Low-tech are technologies that are easily fabricable, adaptable, understandable, repairable, and that use little energy and resources. So low-tech are a step forward toward our collective resilience. The main phase for development now, during the implementing and testing phase, know that not all languages and technologies are created equal. Some may consume less energy than others. Compiled languages generally consume less energy to use than interpreted languages, for example. That said, beware because the skill of developers and the choices of architecture may also have great impacts. So do not only focus on the choice of language, but also on the skills of the developer that will use it. For example, a very good developer will optimize his code better if he has time to do so. So programming skills and time are really important at this stage. Choose sustainable technologies. The technologies implemented in a digital services evolve very quickly. This is highly true in web design, for example. New ones appear and some disappear for lack of a strong community to maintain them. So taking an interest in the seniority and activity of the communities that allow the technology you use, allows you to identify sustainable technologies. This is an important criterion to consider to avoid having to completely rewrite the code of a digital service because of one of its technological bricks has become obsolete and is not maintained anymore. Limit network access. Reducing the traffic generated by your digital service to the strict minimum will reduce its environmental footprints, and you will make it also accessible for low-speed connections. The ideal is to design your service resilient to disconnection. Choose simplicity. Always choose simplicity. Avoid complexity. Code that is easy to understand and implement will also be more durable and easier to evolve. This is the basis of the KISS principle. Keep it simple and stupid. Contribute to the creation of digital commons. Avoid others reinventing the wheel. In fact, whenever possible, choose an open source license and thus contribute to the world of open source software. Not only will you allow others to reduce their own impact by reusing your software, but you might be pleasantly surprised at the community input into your creation. One of the major measure to reduce. Your measurement tools to assess the performance of your code and of your software. Whether it is the amount of data exchange, the page loading time, the execution time, the number of requests, everything can be subject to optimization. Eco-designing at this stage is an endless continuous improvement process. So measurement is essential to this process in order to know what and how to improve. Eric will talk about that later, so I won't focus on measurement here, but keep in mind that finding, however, the right balance between simplicity and optimization is often a key factor. Beware of the rebound effects. Optimization should not be a pretext for adding new non-essential features because you have economized some of the resource consumption by optimizing your code. Use tests. Quality must be at the service of sustainability. The implementation of tests makes it possible to detect anomalies and to ensure a high level of quality of service. This will avoid regressions during its evolution and improve user satisfaction. If your digital service contains too many bugs or instabilities, it may not be used and be difficult to maintain over time. However, focus here on the most essential tests and beware of the automation, because automation of tests will itself be a source of digital fat. So the the main goal here is to develop, in fact, the digital service, to develop or to design the digital service of tomorrow that will be able to run on yesterday's hardware. It will not only reduce untimely hardware changes, but it will also make it easier to maintain and to scale. When you deploy your software in production, know that not all data centers are created equal in terms of environmental performance. Choosing a code of conduct, for example, a labeled data center, means reducing its environmental impact. Other elements, such as its geographical location, as well as its energy efficient indicator, should also be considered. Power, if you can, your infrastructure down whether it is not needed, and take advantage of low carbon energy sources when you can. Size your infrastructure as close as possible to the need. How many server, what type of server, because if you want to anticipate load peaks too much, it will lead to a waste of resources. Use virtual machine, use containerization. At the end of life of a software, and during the life of a software, in fact, it is common to see that some of the data it contains become obsolete. Whether it's old content that is out of date or data about old users, it's important to regularly sort out useful data and delete what is no longer useful, so as to reduce the impact of storage and the impacts of backup. And if a digital service is no longer used, it will continue to have residual impacts on the environment if it's still deployed because of data storage, its hosting, and even regular access to network to other digital service necessary for its day-to-day operation. So it is therefore important to think about treating its end of life. In order to not lose all the knowledge produced, remember maybe to reference its code in the Software Heritage Digital Safeguard Platform. Security. The consequences of a security breach can be numerous. Corrective actions, when possible, are very costly in time and energy, and therefore have an impact on the environment. But security must be a concern present at all stages of the life cycle of a digital service, but a balance needs to be found. Security can easily become resource consuming and can cause equipment obsolescence due to security updates, for example. So here, find a balance between security and obsolescence of the equipment. At each steps of the life cycle of a digital service production, each of these steps will repeat itself throughout the lifespan of the digital service, as I said. And at each of these steps, humans are collaborating. So throughout their daily lives, these humans will generate impacts. For example, they will use computer equipment, they will travel to come to their office or to meet. So establishing a corporate environmental policy to limit all these impacts is crucial. For example, promoting teleworking for employees who have no other solution than the car to come to the office will reduce carbon emissions linked to their commits. Implementing a policy promoting the extension of the life of computers and the use of refurbished equipment will reduce the impact of equipment consumption. We can today keep a computer or laptop for 5 or 7 years. You don't have to change it every 3 years. Last but not least, anticipates the transformation of uses. In fact, through its use, your digital service can generate impact by causing a transformation in behavior. For example, an augmented reality application may have been designed with the objective of making people want to go hiking and to reconnect with nature. But a result can be that its users are being encouraged to travel more kilometers by car to chase away virtual achievements. So it is important to become aware as soon as possible of the behaviors potentially induced by the use of your future digital service in order to reduce their impact as much as possible in a systemic approach, and not only the impact generated by the IT itself. So I'm pretty sure that by now you have figured out what a green software is, but just summarize it. A green software has the least possible negative impact on the environment throughout its life cycle. And as Chris said in the previous presentation, the main focus of the Green Software Foundation is carbon reduction, because it is really important at the stage of the climate change. A green software is limited to the most essential functionalities and allow business transformation by producing indicators and causes changes in behavior that are more sustainable. It doesn't make devices become obsolete. It is smartly written and in the good language and use less power on fewer machines to compute. And maybe it is deployed and runs in data centers that use renewable electricity and energy sources, and it is not on 24 hours a day. Maybe you can shut it down. So thank you very much for your attention here, and Rick, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, thank you. And like Benjamin said, there's a lot of things that we can do, and the key thing is to change the mindset and start to realizing that actually we can do something about our CO2 emissions within our software. We can do something to the solutions that we have at the moment, and we need to start to change the mindset how we operate with our software. So for me, one of the key things how to achieve this is to automate the deployment, how you manage the software. Because if you don't automate making the measurements, are you going to the correct direction or are you going to the worst direction, gets harder and harder. So having automated constant deployments and measuring the outcome of the changes that you make is the key to succeed. So how do we calculate the emission? In the foundation, we have been working to get how to calculate, and this has been big topic and big discussion, how to calculate how much the solution is creating emissions. So when I look formulas like this, there are two things that I always look. What is included in the formula, and then what is excluded from the formula, and what could be the reasons behind it. So if we first start to look on the formula itself, so as the SCIA describes how much carbon the software is or the solution is producing, and we have to measure it by something. It can be by hour, for example, if you have databases. It can be by API call if you have microservices, but it has to be by something. It can be time or some other units like API, or it can be user if you want to calculate it per user how much emissions you are creating. Then there's the second part, the top level of the calculation. So how much carbon it is producing by that unit. So how we calculated this by the energy, how much energy the infrastructure and the code is using, and then multiplying it by the emission that was caused by creating the electricity to produce that service. So that will be something that will affect from time to time, from country to country, from location to location. So that is also one thing that you can affect within your products. And then there is the third component, is the embodied emission of the hardware. So how much carbon was required to create that hardware that you are using to run this service. So these are the core things that you can play with, that you can optimize to make your software better. So you can make the algorithms better to reduce the cost of reduce the amount of electricity that you are using. You can change the location to get or change the electricity provider to get greener electricity, or you can change the hardware to get greener hardware that you're using. So as described here, so those are the three main components that you have to measure and what you can affect to make the software be better. So now the thing, what was missing from the formula is that in the SCI calculations, we are not allowed to offset or remove the carbon by compensating the action. So the calculation requires that you actually need to state how much emissions the software is using. So in the SCA calculations, you cannot offset or compensate it. Then, of course, what happens in the carbon accounting or company level sustainability reports might be then different. But when you are comparing software versions to next version, or when you're comparing software to other software, offsetting doesn't really work in that. And there is quite big consensus on the software foundation that this is the way how we want to measure the carbon emissions so that they are comparable from one place to the other place, and how to optimize the solution to be better. So that we don't ruin the calculation, we are not allowed to offset any results. And I think that this is one of the key things, how we can make true changes to the software and true changes to the solutions that we are using. And that comes by not allowing any this kind of tricks when you compare the solutions. So when we take a look to the actions that we can then take in the development, so there are kind of like two basic sides: is the improving the functional code and then improving the infrastructure where we are running the code. So key things for the software is starting to take into use tools that allow you to measure the usage and the delta when you make changes to the code, how to monitoring that. Are you going to the correct direction or not? Are you making the application work better? Are you saving carbon, or are you increasing the carbon emissions with the changes that you are doing? And when you start to measure the application itself and the code, you can see you will start to find out places where your software is not working efficiently. So this is also a good tool to make the application work better, to find the inefficient code and replacing that with code that is working faster, causing less carbon emission, and also saving money and time for the users. Then there's the other side, is the infrastructure. So this is typically seen as the bigger side, but I kind of feel that these both sides are important. But the infrastructure side is something where you can make really big changes really quickly. It doesn't necessarily take that much skill even to make those changes, and they can like 1-2 days going through the infrastructure and finding out what is working and what is not can cause significant changes in the carbon emission that you are doing. So the key thing is starting to map out how many virtual machines you have, how are you using serverless products, are you using cloud native products within your system, do you have something in on-prem, what you have in on-prem, and if you have IoT devices and how much you have of those, and creating the catalog, what you actually have in each places. Then the next step is to start to investigate, are those machines actually used? It's quite common for the developers to just create virtual machines because they think that they need it next month, but might be that things move slower. So it's quite typical to find virtual machines that are just idle. They're not doing anything. They're just sitting in the infrastructure and not actually producing anything. Then the one key thing is measuring how much you are actually using those servers. So the point is not to utilize them fully 100%, because then the services wouldn't be work, but you want to get quite close to the 80% to maximize the usage of the server. So if you take a look on the energy consumption of the server, having it running with 0 capacity and running it 100% capacity, the difference is not actually that big. So just to have the server on causes you to use the most of the energy, and then having more and more stuff doesn't increase the electricity. It increases, but not as much as just having it on. So you want to maximize the usage of your servers, but also same time making sure that you are not affecting the performance of the applications. So you might need to re-architect your applications to make sure that you're utilizing the infrastructure as well as possible. And then how to do this right sizing of the infrastructure? Well, first thing is you want to get away from on-prem and start to use virtual computers. But virtual computers aren't that efficient as well, so you want to start to utilize products like app service or migrate to the app service, but you can also improve those. So you might want to move to containers because those are even better. And the best solution typically is to utilize the serverless products. So that is kind of like, typically that is the end solution where you want to be. But even starting by going through the catalog, what you have, and then moving them one step at a time to better solution is already a big change to the carbon emission within your infrastructure. Then one thing is to reduce the unnecessary traffic within the network. So going through the network topology and finding out how the API calls are moving. Are you making unnecessary trips? Are you moving the data from continent to continent, from country to country, when you could actually optimize the infrastructure to be closer, to travel less, and optimizing the whole network is also a big source of the when you try to reduce the emissions. And then going through all the batch jobs, are they working correctly? What time, from the carbon point of view, if during, there might be different times in your area when the carbon is mostly produced by solar or wind, and utilizing that green energy within the batch jobs instead of running it at times when you need to use coal to power the infrastructure. So if you take the closer look what it means for the developers in practice, I simplified the development process quite a bit so that I can really focus on the key points. So what the foundation has been working on are the Carbon SDK that you can utilize in your IDE when developing to help you to improve the code while you're developing, giving you the improvement ideas that this is actually how you should do this. This is how you make better code. Use this instead of this. So getting those tips while you are making the code first time. So this is key topic and key tool that we are continuously improving, and it already exists and is available to use. Then going through the pipeline, then the next step, important step is when you decide what code you want to actually then put to production. So, and analyzing the code that you have created, is this going to the correct direction from the carbon point of view? Is this more sustainable code than the previous code base? And are there something that we actually should improve before we go to the production? So having the SCI calculation as a part of the review process, the typical review process that you have when you go before merging your code to your master branch or your development branch. So the foundation is also working on that tool, and there is also big updates coming to that one, and utilizing this tool will help the tech leads and architects to verify that we are going to the correct direction. But of course, this is just the development phase. Then the next phase is to actually calculate the emissions that were actually caused in the production, because the production usage can be different than how the code looks like in the code base. So calculating the true emissions on production where the solution is working is really important, and then you can get the feedback. Were the changes that you made actually beneficial? How much they saved? How much they made the solution to be better? So and most of the cloud providers already have these kind of tools. For example, Microsoft has the emission impact dashboard that will tell you these things. So you can see the carbon emissions that were caused by your organization, and getting to utilizing these tools is quite easy, and you can onboard these tools really quickly to your environments and start measuring what is actually happening and are you going to the correct direction or not. So what are the things that you can do in the quick things that you can do in your daily work is to ask your cloud, ask your development suppliers, ask your partners what they are doing to make sure that the software is emitting the minimum amount of carbon when it's on production. So asking those questions, bringing this up as a topic to your developers, to the suppliers, and making sure that this is something that they also consider, and making it as a priority and a thing that will be measured and monitored during the life cycle of different solutions. And making sure that it is taking into consideration when you select which cloud, which location, what kind of services, what products you are using, how you are architecting and configuring your applications. And kind of like the downside is that if you are not demanding this, the energy consumption typically quite well corresponds with the bill that you have to pay from the infrastructure. So if you are trying to optimize this part, it will help you to reduce the cost as well, and it will help the cloud provider to minimize their cost. That will then also affect your price. So reducing the infrastructure, right sizing it, and selecting the correct tools will also have cost impact to you, and will help you to optimize all the costs that you have. So what can you do is, just to recap the things, is to adopt the green software principles, all the things that Benjamin was discussing, making sure that you have the policies, all the guidelines, how to make better code, how to make sure that you have devices that are properly sized, properly selected, so that they minimize the carbon, starting to measure the software, starting to measure the solution, how much they are causing the emissions and how to optimize that, and then taking the action based on those measurements. And if you don't measure it, you cannot optimize, you cannot make any changes to it. So building applications that are carbon efficient, utilizing electricity as efficient as possible, making sure that you are not spending any other natural resources that are unnecessary, making sure that the infrastructure is not embodying the carbon, any useless carbon that you don't actually need, making sure that the networks have been built properly, making sure that you are running the infrastructure at the times when it's suitable from this perspective also, and making the measurements in the development phase and in the actual production phase as well. So yeah, please bring this up with your suppliers and make sure that they are also taking this into account. Also the cloud providers and other partners that you might have, include this in your processes. There's a lot of tools that can help you. There's a lot of guidelines how to make better software, how to optimize the emissions. So there's a lot of things that you can do lot of easy things that you can do. They don't require that much money or resources, but can help you to save a lot. Benjamin, do you have any final words for before we go to Q&A?
Yes, I already said it, but you have the power and the responsibility as an IT team, as a developer, as a practitioner to develop tomorrow's software that will run in a sustainable way on devices made yesterday, and to allow us to continue using software and information technology in the more sustainable way possible. In fact, that's my final words.
So any questions or comments? You can come off the mute or write it to the chat. So we are happy to answer.
Have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question. Can you please tell us how exactly can we measure our code's carbon emissions? It's like, because I can measure how much my hardware is using. I can measure how much CO2 cloud is producing, right? But what about the in-between? Like if I do a refactor, how can I measure that it really made my carbon emissions lower? How can I exactly measure that?
Yeah, so the foundation has been working to create standardized tools that utilize the SCI calculation. So the foundation has created those tools to make those measurements, if that makes sense. So there's the like SDK to measure or take a look in the software level, and then there are tools to measure in the pipeline level what is the like overall impact of the solution.
Are those tools generally available now at this stage?
Yeah, there are tools that are available, and then there are projects that are still ongoing that you can also participate and contribute to those solutions as well.
Okay, thank you.
So you can find them from the green software.
The GSF also keep a list of software allowing measurement and calculation of the environmental impact. Here is the link to the GitHub, where there is a software list of that can be used to estimate or evaluate some environmental impacts. In fact, there are several different tools. Some of them are only estimation tools. Some of them are really measurement tools that will analyze the consumption of electricity of the battery of a smartphone, in fact, like a Green Spectre maybe. And some of them are estimate tools for web interface, front software. Some of them are on the backend side. There are a lot of tools, but you have to dig in and find the one that suits your use case.
Yeah. And then there are tools like electricity map and watt time that can help you to calculate how much emissions the electricity is causing in your area. So they provide a map that will tell you how much emission is caused by in different locations real time. And also the cloud providers provide information. Did that answer to your question, or?
When it comes to me, yeah, it's fine. Thank you.
Is there another question, maybe?
Maybe it would be good to work on some benchmarks, or to get some examples as well posted on the website, just to give an idea.
Yeah, we can we can send those.
Is there any sort of certification that you can get for example, for a website that the Green Software Foundation offers, sort of something to strive for a project that it meets, a certain grade? Is that something that you've considered?
Yeah, there is certification coming up. Not sure if it has been released yet, but there has been work being done to get that out. Yeah.
So is that the certification that Chris was talking earlier, which I thought was for a person, but I'm thinking for certificate, like to say, like a badge or something that I can put on my website that says it's, it's green certified, or meets a, that way, when you shop, the products often have sort of labeling that gives you an indication of their, what's going, or their calories or whatever, that's involved, the nutritional value. Is there any thoughts to doing something in that space for software that you could sort of label your software a certain level? Just curious.
Yeah, currently there is not that kind of label, but I know that one has been also discussed, but it's still open if at what kind of priority that would have. But yeah, so currently there is not that kind of product or that kind of solution. Of course, then one of the key points is the sustainability reports that companies themselves provide. But well, they are a little bit different thing, but I think that has been kind of like the direction where things has been going.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, here's Susanna Kovacheva from IDC. I would like to ask about whether to your knowledge there is another standard or a forming just being formed that could be comparable with Green Software Foundation work.
Benjamin, do you want to take that?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you repeat, please? I was putting the link of the.
Yeah, not sure whether you can hear me well. I'm just wondering whether this is isolated initiative of Green Software Foundation, or whether there are parallel projects, not maybe that far as you are, but whether you see.
In France, there are multiple initiatives, like the French Institute for Sustainability. There is one spin-off that has been created in Switzerland and one in Belgium. There were also other initiatives in France, like Boavista, which joined the Green Software Foundation. I think I saw their logo on the Green Software Foundation webpage. So this is not an isolated initiative. This is needed, and people are moving the lines to make it happen, in fact.
Yeah. And another question would be, you were recommending the technology users to ask their suppliers whether they take into account, software carbon intensity. So, to your knowledge of the market, what percentage of suppliers are able to answer this question? Do you think? Yes. Okay, we know that, or you said that it's cloud providers that are able to provide calculation for development process. So would it be that anybody who collaborates with these three? I just think that it's not such a straightforward question, to say yes or no. So it's basically about how far are the suppliers, software suppliers, or how many of them, or do all of them consider carbon intensity? What would be your opinion about the situation in Europe, let's say?
You want to answer that, Eric, or I?
Yeah, well, I mostly know about Microsoft because I work with Microsoft technologies, but they have been releasing a lot of new APIs and dashboards and tools to monitor these things, and they have been focusing on that during the past year a lot. And at least they have been taking a really strong like openness to this, so they wanna give the information. And I know that Google and AWS has been doing the same thing, and they have been releasing that information, but not that detailed look if they have it for all products, but they are coming at least for those three.
OVH in France is also producing some metrics and is working with the French National Research Center in Digital Sciences to that. But beware of the offset when Microsoft, AWS, and Google display carbon neutral trajectories. They always include offsetting the emission, and they don't take the full scope 3, in fact, of the emission. So you have to check the methodology used, because there is actually no real standardization method of computing the scope 3 emission, in fact. And that's the major part of the carbon emission of the cloud providers.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, I have 2 questions. Start with the first one is, I guess we know that the distance your data travels can also have an impact on the carbon footprint of your data, of your software. So choosing data centers that are closer can be better. And so what should we choose in between closer infrastructure that maybe offsets their carbon footprint versus further data centers that are actually green and use real renewable energies? Is that an easy question to answer, or is that?
No, it's not that easy, because there is a lot of factors that you have to consider, but that's why the measurement is so important, that you need to measure your kind of like how it looks for you, so that then you can make the best decision for you individually. So there are not really like rule of thumb yet how to make it, like how to make the best decision with that, but you can find like quite a lot of information about different data centers, what kind of innovations they have been using. Are they, for example, recycling the heat that the data center is providing to heat up the houses nearby, or other things, and then also utilizing the APIs to get the actual measurement of the electricity or the carbon emissions that the services are using. But the whole journey is still not that transparent that you could make like final choices, but you can get quite good estimate of the different stages and then look the best solution for you. And of course it varies a lot depending what kind of energy different countries are, energy sources countries are building up.
Right. So I guess measuring your end-to-end emission is I guess very important in that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's for the first question. The second question, I guess, is maybe a bit more specific to France. We know we have some new laws coming into effect, the green laws in 2024. And I guess my question is, what do you foresee that being the impact of us as developers? Sort of vague to me right now what it means, but do you at the Green Software Foundation foresee some real impacts that we should foresee as developers, and how do we prepare for that?
So this French law is a first step. It's focused on the training of the engineering of tomorrow and the the administration of big cities and big collectivities. But the next step in France, the government is working with ADEME and INRIA and other entity to produce some eco-design label to digital services and to be able to label your software like your dish cleaners, in fact, is labeled in energy efficiency. So this will be the next stage, and the sooner you begin to change your practice and include eco-design good practices in your software development, the better the labelization process will be when it will be mandatory, in fact.
Right, and when are those labels coming into, I guess, do we know that yet, or?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
The labels, those ADEME labels, or do we know when they're, did they exist today? Or?
No, they don't exist today. There is a national program that will be launched maybe in September or in January 2023. And this program will be during 4 years. And the main goal of this program is to define a standard methodology to compute this label. So we can hope for it in the next 4 years, maybe.
Yeah. Okay, we can continue that discussion in the chats, but Fernando, are you ready, and do you want to take control or show your
we
screen?
are. And sorry, we're
just setting up.
Do you want to share yourself or take the control?
I'll take the control, don't worry about it.
Okay.
Thank you. There you go. This is on, then we can share there. And question, do you want us to take the control entirely, or can we share our own screen? Just making sure that we don't screw up anything.
Yeah, which one is better for you?
Yeah, if you want present, Scott, and then I have it over here.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry for a little bit of the setup, but just kind of wanted to say hi from North America, and Romania is right now on France, but and I'm gonna let us do a little bit of round of introductions, but just want to say thank you for joining today. My name is Fernando Meyer. I'm a group manager in our experience side here at Avanade, working on understanding and using emerging techs to make the user experience better. And one of the things that I, like Scott and Romain, are very passionate about is not only the engineering side, which we've discussed quite a bit on here, but it's also the how do we work on working with the designers in order for not only the code to be efficient, but also the way that we design the applications that we do to be efficient as well. So again, Scott, will you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm also a user experience designer at Avanade, which is a joint venture between Microsoft and Accenture. And so my role, mostly working with companies across industries to find out the needs of end users and design software that meets those needs and kind of overcomes any challenges that they might be running into.
Awesome. And Romain, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. So my name is Romain Audebert. I'm part of Accenture Technology, and I'm responsible for the sustainable IT stream in France. So working with our teams on the development of assets and offering to help our clients reduce the footprint of their IT, whether it is on the end user device part or the data center and of course the software.
Awesome. So today's presentation is going to go a little bit around what's the problem with design and why it matters. why are we going to, why focusing on eco-design as well as code is very important. We will then walk you over some best practices that we have in, we're going to have some next steps of things that you can do with your design teams, as well as making a pledge for the Sustainable Web Manifesto. So to get it going, I'll pass it to you, Scott.
Thanks. So I think a lot of people here probably have some sense of, that digital services are causing a lot of pollution, but we'll just set a little context so that we're all on a level playing field. I think from an end user's perspective in particular, emissions can kind of be out of sight, out of mind when it comes to digital services. So taking a very tangible example, like an iPhone kind of makes it clear. This breakdown shows that the majority of emissions come from the very early stage in the life cycle, sourcing raw materials and manufacturing, but a significant portion, about a third, comes from the use of the software itself. So that's what we'll be focusing on today in our presentation.
Thank you, Scott. And just let's take a step back on the environmental situation. I won't be so too long on that topic, as I think you are all aware of that. But just to illustrate that with a framework, one of many around environmental situation and impact, that was developed by a group of scientists from the Stockholm Resilience Center in 2009. And the idea was to identify the processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the Earth system. So they proposed 9 boundaries within which the humanity can continue to develop and thrive. And of course, crossing these boundaries increase the risk of large-scale irreversible environmental changes. So it spans from chemicals pollution to ocean acidification, biosphere integrity, and of course climate change. And for each of them, they define quantitative criteria to determine when we are crossing the line. So for example, for climate change, this is the carbon dioxide concentration set to 350 parts per million, and we are now around 420 parts per million. So what we are seeing that with the green part that represent the safe operating space, and as of now we are seeing that we have already exceeded 5 boundaries, and a recent new assessment revealed that we might have transgressed a 6th boundary with fresh water and dramatic changes on the global water cycle. So that's the situation. Now let's see. You can go next, Scott. What is the impact of IT, and to what extent IT is part of the problem? Well, IT is a very energy consuming sector, accounting for around 5% of global electricity demand, and 4% of primary energy consumption. And as you all know, the main source of CO2 emission is due to the combustion of fossil energy. So this is why we have a whole dematerialized sector that is accounting for almost 4% of global GHG emission, exceeding airplane industry footprint, and that is expected to double by 2025. And as you know, CO2 emission is the main driver for climate change. So this is one part, and also this is not the only source of impact, as we extract a lot of raw materials and rare metals to produce our hardware. And at the end of the journey, there are a lot of electronic waste that are generated each year, around 50 million tons. And unfortunately, we are only recycling a portion of it, around 12.5%. You can go next, Scott. But hopefully, things are moving on due to pressure from different parts. from regulation. We have already talked about it, from customers and investors that are asking companies to embed sustainability into their strategy, and so that's why we have we have today around 60% of Fortune 500 companies that have set goals to act on the climate crisis, and the IT department, the CIO, wants to do its part and is doing its part on this journey.
Yep. And as Romain was saying, I think companies are taking significant action in the right sustainable direction. But that's not to say that at an individual stakeholder level, we might have to be the voice for sustainability and making sure that people in their different roles understand the benefits. You might hear that sustainability will have added costs or something like that, but there are lots of benefits that sustainable software can bring, and raising those and being the voice for those, tailoring the benefits to the individual stakeholder who you're speaking with, can make sure that that value is conveyed.
Yeah. So no, thank you both. So what is exactly eco-design and why does it matter? So eco-design is not something entirely new, right? Like, it's not that we are now just doing software products that or hardware/software products that have some sort of carbon problem and that we are trying to solve. This has actually existed for quite a while, and you can see this in resources like the book Cradle to Cradle, who has an entire certification program, and that was used as an industrial designers in order to really define how is that a product should be created from end to end while be very, very sustainably conscious. When I was an industrial designer back in my previous career life, not only you are looking over at the waste that you generate with your packaging and the material, and as you saw from Scott's presentation, like 30% of the waste that your phone will do is because of you using it, but there is an entire slew that went into creating that phone, right? Like, there was prototyping, there was sketching, there were teams that were assembled, there were trips to different factories. All of that really affects the environmental impact that this product has. And software is no different whatsoever, right? The way that we build it, the way that we structure it, just happens to be as equally sustainable or less sustainable as possible. And that's why referencing frameworks like Cradle to Cradle become important, right? Because we have to make sure that we're doing the least environmental impact as possible, not only through once your product is up and live and running, but also through the creation of it.
That's right. And when we talk about design, it's a big field and it means different things to different people. But we can kind of easily break it down into 3 sections that each apply to sustainability a little differently. For service design, it's something that Fernando has a lot of experience in, thinking about that holistic systems point of view, which is something that is aligned with Cradle to Cradle, thinking about how the product sits within the larger life cycle of the overall service. User experience design is more focusing on the interaction from the user standpoint. And so we'll get it a little later. We'll talk about best practices in terms of designing the interactions to be sustainable, but also guiding users' behavior toward a more sustainable choice, or at least presenting those options. And the last one is visual design, which is the aesthetics of the service. And there's a lot you can do to optimize the visuals to make sure that you're kind of using as little energy as possible.
Thank you, Scott. So green software design starts with one key principle, is the necessity to challenge the need. As we know that around 45% of the capabilities are never used, and 70% are considered as not essential. So first, you need to ask yourself, what are the real needs of this functional unit? what is the value of the tasks that I'm offering with the service, and is this capability really necessary? Can we do it differently? What would happen if we didn't have it? So you can imagine a rating from 1 to 5 in terms of necessity of the capability of each functional unit that you define, you want to design. And to illustrate that, Microsoft research has shown that by changing the number of items that are displayed on the Bing's result page, the underlying physical infrastructure can be reduced by up to 80%. So that means you reduce the number of servers by up to 80%. So yeah, the first thing before even starting is challenging the need.
Yeah, no, thanks, Romain. So what are some of best practices? Like, I know that a lot of you, well, all of you should be interested on this topic if you are in this presentation, right, and attending the summit. But if you wanted to work with your designers, particularly since we have a group full of engineers, what are some of the conversations that you should be having, right? And even as you're evolving your career on IT, and then you start managing designers or being a product manager again, what are those conversations like? And I like to point out this quote by Frederick Bordage around that he says pretty much that the sooner we start, as Romain mentioned, is the better, right? Like really designing those design specifications and the prototyping, and have a thought of how is that you're going to be building the product, as we said, in challenging the need for it or challenging the reasons and how is it going to exist, is how we really can go and do a bigger reduction on the impact that a software can really have.
Yeah, and just to point out some good news also to start. A lot of the established best practices for user experience design bring a product in a more sustainable direction because you're only showing what's relevant to the user. You're shortening the journey as much as possible, which is less time on the website or app, and you're reducing the amount of pain points for the user and for the design team. So keeping those things in mind is beneficial off the bat. And yeah, next, and just to highlight also the point on accessibility, which has been a big, really important topic in design over the last few years in particular. Accessibility is aligned with sustainability because things like some of the heaviest aspects of a site, like an auto-playing video or big imagery, are often the biggest pain points for people with accessibility issues. So removing those helps both at the same time. And I like this quote because it makes the point about separating content and presentation, which to me means kind of putting the message first in the most simple and straightforward way without letting kind of the more fancy design elements kind of get in the way.
Yeah, and for me, sustainability is in around accessibility is also very important, right? Like during the Q&A, there was this question around, do we have badges that we can put on the websites? And yeah, that is something that we can definitely help as designers. And if you see kind of like the reference on the real world, we have the Red Dot Award on industrial design, or here at least in North America. And I know in a lot of parts of the world, I'm originally from Spain, we also have our LED buildings logos that you can see all around. But in reality, right, accessibility, as Scott mentioned, is something that is happening quite around. There is quite a few standards, and it's really about how you use your site and that separation of content and presentation. And it's really like overall, you can see what their web standard is if you go and inspect the code, but it's something that you just feel. And that you just feel is very, very important, right? Like when you're designing a website, all of the team, not only the designers, should be really thinking around, is the content that I'm putting in here really needed? What are the core services that most users are looking for? How can I have the user reach their goal faster? You can see a little bit of an example down here. A traditional website that might have a lot of content that we went very heavy for SEO content right in the day. Sometimes that is actually not the most efficient thing, right? Like the most efficient of the sites is those websites where you can come in, spend as little time as you can in there because they are so darn easy that you can complete your tasks, understand the message right away, and get going. There is nothing more sustainable than that, other than obviously making sure that your backend resources are on the right place, but like ensuring that the time that you're spending in front of the screen is minimal is super critical. In order to do this, there is a few things that you once have to consider. So in here, you can see this little chart in the middle around cost management, client expectations, environment, and technical feasibility. And this is because in order to understand the impact that your site does, you have to really understand the current environmental impact that sites like yours, either an older version of your site or similar to yours, like if you're developing a website, a site, something on the metaverse, again, look over at examples that might not be quite a one-one relationship, but can be tangential in order to like determine things about what mistakes that they did or did we do. What is the user experience? How can we improve it? How many users are using this website? How will this product really impact the world in a negative way in the short term, in the long term? And what are some of the things that you can do in order to improve that? And again, if a bunch of people were to use your site at the same time, would it have the same impacts? If not, what kind of impacts will it have? Is there a way to change that? Is there a way to improve it? Again, all of these are very important considerations to have in mind. But the other thing that is also very important is start from where you set your design team. Here, and it looks a little waterfall, sorry about that, but in reality, this is kind of the standard agile model, right? And in tech, we praise agile a lot, and agile actually is pretty efficient. But in reality, how many companies do you know that do agile really, really well? There is not that many. And throughout the sprints, you have your design, your development, you release and do your UAT, and you really have your product management and the stakeholders taking most of it. This is pretty efficient. Again, usually sprints run about 2 weeks or less. That being said, sometimes you don't have enough features to do a successful UAT until the very end, until you have a release. And waiting for all of that, while it's efficient in the way that you're structuring a team and structuring a release, it's not always the most successful way to be sustainability conscious. Not to say that agile is wrong, all the opposite. But one of the things that we have to think about is actually not like, as we were talking, bring the designers up front to the conversation, as well as what we call now a voice of customer team, which is that team of people who might not be as stakeholders, that actually users of the product, that can guide you through the process and use the agile methodology to really implement this and really make a successful impact. This thing that we call sustainable human-centered design model is really based out of Google Ventures Design Sprint. And it's proven that while, yes, it involves more people up front, and again, we're talking about having them on meetings, right, which is equally as wasteful than just joining later on the process. What it turns out, though, is that because you're making them and you're involving these people on the decision making right away, at the very end, you're actually producing less human work hours that goes to waste because there is less bugs, there is better content, the site or the application is easier to use, which in results generates in less energy waste. So again, one of the big things or the big takeaway from this is that sometimes the carbon that you produce at first can be heavily offset and have more impact than the carbon that you are going to be generating later, right? And in this case, like, again, bringing all the points to the conversation earlier really, really matters.
Yeah. And also thinking about that very early design phase is thinking about how you can set some benchmarks for sustainability metrics. And there are a lot of tools out there already that you can easily find and implement if you have something like a website that you can just plug in the URL, and it will give you at least a starting point to understanding how much carbon your site is using. A page speed test is also a really good indication of how heavy it is, and it's something that you can track over time to see if making design changes affects those scores. The other thing I'd mention quickly is just while using those sites is really helpful, there's some manual techniques too for just getting a tangible handle on how carbon intensive your site or app can be. And that can be as simple as counting the steps in the journey from the user needs to take from starting to finishing a task. Reducing those steps is heading in the right direction. And also doing an inventory of media assets. Those are oftentimes some of the most heavy elements of a page. So making sure that you're cutting out what's not necessary, or doing some of the other things we'll mention later in terms of replacing images with vectors and that kind of thing, that can make a big difference. Yeah. And then lastly, about the kind of early phase too, is you're thinking about your product not just standalone, but where it fits within the whole life cycle. So this goes back to what Fernando was talking about in terms of cradle to cradle. But just to give another example, if you're talking about an on-demand grocery delivery app, for example, it's not just about how the user interface looks or feels to the end user, but also what decisions you're presenting. So can you present the option to have the groceries delivered not during rush hour, or have the user opt into using less packaging? So those are related to the product, but think about it within the whole kind of design system.
Yeah, and as Scott already touched upon a little bit, right? Like as you're building your site, I mean, obviously, or like your app, obviously visuals are very, very important, right? But I don't know if you all remember, but Facebook, well, Meta back then, Facebook, got into big trouble because they were preloading videos on their app, and a lot of people were going crazy about it because the amount of internet usage that it took out of people's phone plans, right? But that not only took usage out of people's phone plans, it actually consumed a lot of carbon and a lot of energy. So in reality, like again, things that we recommend you is like, if you were to have videos, like how many times have you not seen those websites with a giant video hero image that is just autoplaying, that became quite popular like a few years ago? Like all that kind of stuff, like really think about it, like, is this really bettering the user experience, or are we doing this for marketing, right? Because making sure that those videos are not the highest resolution and making sure that they don't autoplay can make up for 60 to 90% of all the internet traffic in the world, right? So do not autoplay them, optimize them for each device. Like, do you really need that 4K, now 8K video on a tiny phone screen? Probably not. Cut down on the length of the video whenever it's possible. And again, replace them with photography or even infographics, right? Like one of the other things that we were talking is sustainability and accessibility are really hand to hand, right? So some of the times, even having a video is not the most efficient because a web reader cannot catch it, or the way that you present information is actually quite interesting. If you go to the website informationisbeautiful.com, you can see a collection of beautiful infographics that were very sustainably made, that are made in order to look just like those videos, that are very cool and like grabs people attentions, but at the same time passes the message in a way more efficient way. At the same time, I'm not telling you all photos and infographics are perfect. Infographics can be if they are made in vectors, right? But a lot of the times we use PNGs, JPEGs, GIFs, and let's talk about GIFs as they're like very inefficient in the world. So when you're looking at photography, again, try to use vectors instead of graphics. Like a CSV file tends to be way more efficient, faster to load, and at the same time uses less energy. Optimize the images for those screens. Try to use black and white photography whenever possible. Again, try to make sure that those images load quickly and like load right away. And avoid multiple picture elements like a carousel. Like those carousels that are very famous on websites, they're great. And again, there is a space for them. I'm not saying go and take away from them. But if they're not really needed for what you want to do, consider if it's an element that you are having there as a wow factor, or if it's something that you're having there because it makes the user experience better.
Thank you, Fernando. So green design is also about how you can shift, how you can influence user behaviors, and eventually embark the users in your sustainable IT journey, in the sustainable IT journey. So there are several ways of doing it, but it can start with providing users with the information on the energy consumption or the carbon footprint of the service. Well, if users don't know how much energy they are using, they won't consider it as part of the experience. So that's why it can be useful to, for example, label the carbon cost of using one website, or notify the users when they have exceeded the average amount of power, or when the demand usage is high, for example. And that's what the Nest thermostat, for example, is doing. Their user interface shows a green leaf when set at an energy efficient temperature. So one first thing could be to provide the feedback and provide information to the user. You can go next. You can go one step further by not only displaying the information, but also helping the user change their habits with, for example, I would say green scenario simulation and comprehensive information about the carbon footprint, the environmental impact of their choices. For example, Google Map is now indicating the least carbon intensive route that you can use, and also using analogies. It can be useful to use analogies and not only CO2 emission figure, to as well to embark even more the users, the customer in the sustainable IT journey, showing, for example, the amount of CO2 and the equivalent of that is the equivalent of taking 100 cars off the road. So that's an important thing.
Yeah, and just another important note there, just to add to what Romain just said. We a lot in this call are consultants. We work for a consultancy, and we used to be very good at like traveling a lot of the time. So one of the things that you can start seeing is that companies like ours, not exactly ours, but like similar consultancies, one of the things that they're starting to use this technology for is to give their employees a carbon allowance, that they can be using these tools, right, in order to like actually be green and achieve those things that the companies want to achieve as they become more sustainable.
Yes, thank you, Fernando. And last but not least, don't forget the impact of design choices for default options, as they are by definition the options that are the most used, and thus the ones with the most impact. So there are also some example. For example, in image libraries like Unsplash, the default option for download is the original size, which is obviously the heaviest. So, and if we choose for example, the smallest option, this could be 20 times lighter than the original size. So it has a huge impact in terms of footprint. WhatsApp as well, media auto download is the default option. So you can imagine that it could be only the case when you are connected on to your Wi-Fi and not when you are in a mobile connection. Spotify, there is a data saver mode that turns off video clips and lowers audio quality, but it is not the default option. So don't forget default options and the design choice you can make to reduce the footprint at the end of the journey.
Yeah. No, thank you, Roman. And as you remember, we mentioned around separating content from the usage itself, right? And a lot of it is the way that you are thinking and building. The reason why the examples that we just gave you are efficient is because the way that the content or the way that the information about sustainability is laid out, it's clear. But again, when you are doing that, make sure that you are very transparent to the users. You use, again, short paragraphs, bulleted lists, abbreviations, everything that can make the site easier to use. I work on a few projects where we've even looked over at how and what level of academic readency it's available, like literacy, it's available on the sites, right? And a lot of the times we write websites in a very technical way. Even this discussion, right? Like we were having it and it's technical and it's because we're interested. But we need to understand that we are not the audience for the products that we're using, in that making sure that a site is as easy as to comprehend as for explaining it to a child, or a lot of us here are ESL, which means English is not our first language. Again, making sure that you can read that and you can get that right away, very important. So using little things like the nest, green leaf, or writing words that are very simple to like visualize and understand are great. Structure your information correctly, make sure that it's accessible, make sure that, again, with accessibility, that you can control the size of that text by defaults so that the style sheets don't take over. Because yes, while marketing is important, making sure that it's usable for your user is even more important than that. And again, do not put important information on images. That is not great for accessibility, but it's also not great for sustainability because now you have to load it. And then looking over at the structure itself or your site, when you are using fonts, and this is something that is funny because it also happens on printmaking, is look over at what fonts that you are using. If you're using something pre-installed that is a standard, it actually will reduce the bandwidth usage and the speeds of the site. If you use a font that is shaped in certain ways, it actually will make the page of your content much shorter. Similar to when you used to, like there is some fonts that are way more efficient for printing on paper. There is some fonts like WOOF formats that are way more responsible. And again, the number one thing is don't use anything too fancy because that hinders on accessibility, which also reduces the uses of a site.
And what goes hand in hand is optimizing content is optimizing for the specific device that your users are on. And more and more we see that users are using their mobile phones as kind of their primary device. They expect to be able to do any kind of transaction from their mobile phone. So that's one reason to design for mobile first. But also from a sustainability standpoint, it's the best practice because as a general rule of thumb, the smaller the device, the less energy it's going to use. The other thing I'd mention is that from a design perspective, having a small real estate is a really helpful design constraint because it having a very small screen to work with makes sure that you're only putting forward the most essential information, the most essential kind of options for the user. From there, you can expand on if you need to. But starting designing from the mobile screen make sure that you're kind of only doing what's necessary first.
Yeah, it also, as Scott mentioned, creates a very good user experience that is centralized on your user. And in reality, how many people are really now accessing websites on a mobile device, right? Or even applications? It's quite a bit. Yet when you look at how many sites are mobile compliant, they've been better and better, but it's still something that, for example, for accessibility, we are fighting all the time. The other thing that is very important is consider the type of environment and a screen that you will use for your interface when you're working with your designers to have designs. Here, for example, you can see some brightness levels between the now very famous night mode, and I have some comments about it. But for example, you can see that in certain situations, particularly when you are in a dark environment, you can reduce quite the usage of the brightness of your screen to a level that it's much nicer for the user. While that being said, I'm not saying get away from the traditional white background websites, right? Mostly because a lot of the devices that we use still today are LCD screens that, well, you can see here on the example as RGB5, it's more efficient because you are bringing the brightness down at a darker level. Black colors on LCDs are actually very energy consumption heavy. So again, it's one of those that you still need to have that balance. But try to really use other screen technologies whenever possible. OLED is a great example for this, right? OLED is one of those technologies where actually using night mode all the time saves less energy because the pixels itself are turned off, which reduces, again, less of that, the 30% waste from when you are using your device. That being said, OLED is not always the answer. There are situations where OLED is not bright enough. So again, consider what is that you're gonna do this. Like, are you gonna have this on a portable device? Is this gonna be on a kiosk in somewhere that the sun is gonna affect? Where is that your interface is really gonna live? And this is very important, not only in the way that you optimize the screen, but also the way that you optimize how the screen looks like. I had a client who brand's colors were red and yellow, and they had this kiosk. I do a lot of work in emerging tech out in the field, and the sun was pounding them all the time. And they insisted that the website that we were generating and the app that we were generating for those kiosks had to use their brand colors everywhere. Well, what turns out is that if you have an LCD screen with sun pounding on it on red and yellow colors, is that you have to have your brightness increase at 100%, and you have to get very close at it. On top of that, you have to add some sort of reflectivity layer in order for it to be matte and be able to see it. Again, all in all, creating a lot of waste by having the screens that way, where you could have use other colors like black or darker tones that and still brand their website, right, for the appropriate use that they will need. But by being so strict on their branding, they actually were generating a lot of energy consumption. One of the other things that I want to talk about, and we're about to almost come to the end of the presentation, so like bear with me, these are just a few things, is as we were talking, right, when you're building your website, think about what plugins and widgets that you're using, what kind of downloads that you're using. On the plugins and widget size, do you really need to have that Google Maps loaded there, or can you just add an image that it's tiny? And sometimes interactivity with it is very important. Sometimes it's not. Those social media icons, that social media tiles that are very cool looking in some apps and websites are not the most efficient, because now you're talking to an external SDK and API. It's just not great. So try to use them as least as you can. Just send them over to your social media site. Tracking location. It's also very energy consumption. Not to say that GPS is not great and that applications don't need that, right? But like, do you really need to be tracking your users at all the time? Not only is less energy efficient, but at the same time, it's downright security privacy concerns, as we know, right? And then when you're talking about downloads, not make everything downloadable, actually make it load once and be able to be saved. But at the same time, when you have some downloads available, like we talk about in here, a group of engineers, right? And some people mention about hardware. If you have drivers, if you have files that you want to download, like always put the size that the file is. Try to lower the resolution and compress, and write a brief description of what the file that they're about to download, whatever it is, so that people can make the decision of, is this something that I really need, or is this something that I just don't? Most importantly, and this one is a little controversial, and I'm going to get into that, try to use new technologies when available. This is a nod to one of our parent companies at Avanade, which is Microsoft. We just released this wonderful way of creating Power Apps using Figma, right? So that way you can have your designers generating content in applications and prototypes that can actually be quickly used on as your front end for your apps and websites. That being said, do not think that Power Apps are the most carbon efficient. They're not. So always think and keep in mind what's the use case that you're going to have. Similarly, a lot of the companies, myself included and our company included, are jumping into the metaverse, and we're coming up with our metaverse strategies. And this is all well and fine, but make sure that before you say, oh, let's just have a water cooler or just people connected 24/7, and this is the way that we're going to go past the COVID world. Think about how many resources are being used when you connect to the headsets or any AR, VR type of contents. They can be as heavy as the other stuff that you've seen, right? Not to say that flying 100 people to a place to do a workshop, or imagine that we were all in this conference together, it will be less carbon efficient that now that, for example, we're here on Teams or in a potential metaverse world, right? But just make them worth, but use the new technologies when available. And a few other things just before we wrap up is, again, things that have been very famous on sites and websites is avoid infinite scrolling. You're pinging the backend all the time. It increases the weight. It's not great. Those new search behaviors that a lot of us love, like auto-completion and suggestion mechanisms, not the most efficient. So make sure that you create them in a way that is a little bit more efficient and try to use them as least as you can. Again, this is kind of where the balance with usability and need comes very in hand, because sometimes they do actually make the interactions with websites faster, but at what cost, right? So it's one of those things that we have to think. And as we're tethering our phones, but it also happens everywhere, think about notifications and how is that you send them and why is that you're sending them. For a while, we got into this whole push notification world for marketing, which was great, but at the same time, it wasn't the most energy efficient, right? And make those, pretty much what I'm saying is, when you're notifying your users, make sure that those are really, really meaningful. If it's that you're gonna use this.
Yeah, I know we just covered a lot of ground there. Just wanted to call out a few kind of the unifying principles that we can all keep in mind when we're in these dialogues between designers and engineers. So we're all kind of part of the solution together. These are kind of the best practices, but ultimately they'll have to be applied case by case to the specifics of the product or the company. But hopefully they're helpful as kind of guidelines. That being said, the earlier you can start to incorporate these principles into the design process, the bigger impact you can make, and thinking about how they apply to not just the product, but the entire system from end to end, from cradle to cradle. That way you're nudging not only the user to take a more sustainable behavior, but making the platform they're using more sustainable itself. And lastly, just it's great to make these changes and so that the products themselves are more sustainable, but making sure that we're all communicating the value of sustainability can help make for a lot more lasting impact. So we'll get buy-in from the stakeholders that are really driving the decisions.
Yeah, no, thanks, Scott. And so what are some next steps? And this, I bring it up because I know that not a lot of people, and I will be shocked if there is a lot of you out there, are designers in here, and you say, well, this is all great, but like, what are some of the things that we as technologists in general can do, right? And the first thing that we can all do is really sign up for the Sustainable Web Manifesto. I don't think that I have to repeat that to this group, but let's just think that, again, if the internet itself was a country, it will be the 6th largest polluter in the world. So joining movements like this, either as a designer or as an engineer or as a person in IT, is very important to really create clean, open, regenerative, efficient, and honest and resilient websites. And they have an entire amount of resources that you can go and read and actually do this by signing up through this type of things. Obviously, also use a lot of the standards that we're generating at the Green Software Foundation. Attend conferences like this. make sure that the voice is heard. And again, try to connect with people outside of what you do, like designers like ourselves, as early as you can, just so that, again, we all are making sure that these applications that we're building really make an impact. And most importantly, again, here are some of the things that you can do. I assume that if you're here, you're already part of the Green Software Foundation, but if not, you should for sure join it. Review and bookmark to learn more about sustainable design. We will be writing some articles. Scott and I are putting a class together that we're going to release at some point, and you should all be happy to join. Contact us for anything. Again, join any of the working groups and participate in the weekly calls. Encourage others that are not in tech to do that. We attend to those. And again, I am a little technical, but I'm not an engineer. Scott is as well. It's one of those things that is for everybody. Again, try to bring leadership into your companies. Start the conversation again as early as you can, and really identify sustainable projects to talk to your stakeholders and communicate the value of all the stuff that we show you. So I know that we took a lot of time, but we have about 8 minutes, and I just wanted to open up for questions for either Romain, Scott, myself, or anybody, just to answer some of the stuff that you may have. But thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Super instructive. I guess my question is, so I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, but it's the so that first stat that you showed, something I've come across lots of time, but it's the percentage of emissions that creating the terminals emits versus the software. As a software dev, obviously we're interested in that part where it's the usage of the terminals that are important. So it usually goes around, it's around like 30, 60 like you showed, or 45, 55 sort of a thing. But I've recently found out that in countries where it's like the energy is very low carbon, like in France, for example, where you have nuclear energy, it can be as little as like 8% for the usage of terminals, whereas like the production is like 76%. So I guess the question is, how do you justify to your stakeholders or whoever you're working with, your clients, the manager, investors, these, I guess, compromises that you have to make, like not using the font that they want potentially, or not using the video background and stuff. And I guess this is a challenge that we have as developers: is how do you sell that, right? Like how do you justify that whole thing?
Yeah, and this is one of those that, I mean, yeah, you are 100%. I'm 100% in agreement that a lot of the world is very different. A lot of the world is using the internet also in a very different way, right? Like we would like to believe that everybody has the same access that we do, but it's not quite right. I used to work for Nokia back in the day, and feature phones were still a thing just because of it. And we were creating websites that were efficient for like African countries that might not have the fastest bandwidths in a lot of cases. In your case, to answer a little bit your question, so as a designer, one of the things that I like to use, and I've also done product management work and I've done development myself, is to go ahead and show accessibility. Again, one of the main reasons of why we're advocating for all of this is because we want to make things more user-friendly, right? And as we showed, accessibility is really hand-to-hand tied to sustainability. So if there are ways that you can show that your site is actually better, and by better, I mean more usable, yet at the same time sustainable, this is great. That's another reason of why getting everybody on page right ahead of time produces less mistakes. Yes, the usage of the software itself is very energy either efficient or not efficient, and they might get away with the whole I want to use this font or I want to use this color type of conversation, right? What they would not get away is if people cannot use their applications. So imagine that you spend a lot of time doing development, and because you follow the traditional model, you come to UAT or even sometimes post-release, and realize that your application doesn't work. Well, the use of Agile thing is like, well, it doesn't matter. We will iterate and we will change it. But having to recreate those portions actually generated waste, right? Because waste is not about only the usage that we have, but it's also about how the product was built. And this is where cradle to cradle comes really in place. Yes, the site is up there. Yes, the site is running, same with applications. But if it's not being used by anybody, there was an insane amount of hours wasted in human hours, like as we're coding. I mean, I've done it in the past where like I have 2 monitors and my screen. It's very wasteful, and it's kind of why we make that analogy into real, like, and not real. What I mean is like traditional product design that is physical, because back then we will like, now we have 3D printers, which are also great, but very gray area, right? Because you are still generating prototypes that you are still probably throwing away and all that kind of stuff, is the same thing in here. And that is kind of one of those things that even with phones, one of the things that we have, and you will say, well, but like we just buy the phones or we just buy the computers. But yesterday when we were in the Boston panel, someone made the point about like, do we really need to change our phones every year? And that's probably an answer that was no. And like, well, in reality, the answer is just no. But it's one of the things that we have to communicate as we talk about accessibility and carbon and emissions, is talking about how much time building that stuff, like the technology that we have takes. Like I do a lot of work on IoT and metaverse. And as I was mentioning, it's very sustainable, but at the same time, it's one of those things that you have to fight them off. Is like, do you really need that type of thing? Do you need just it pretty much to just go back to your answer is probing and fight for the user, which is why user experience is important. I am a firm believer that we don't create experiences just happen, but we create segues for those to happen, right? And those segues have to be efficient, well laid out, and if so, they will also become sustainable.
Great, thanks.
Awesome. So thank you so much for the presentation and the session. So Fernando, Scott, Romain as well. Thank you so much for that. Up next, we have our facilitated workshop. If you do have any additional questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat. I'm sure Fernando and Scott will be happy to carry on answering those. I assume. Otherwise, we will press on to our workshop segment, which I'm going to run. So I guess I'll come on camera, and I think we are good to stop the recording as well for this session. So I'm just going to do that.